April 13, 1961, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Private John Arthur Bennett, just 19 years old, is led through the cold corridors of the military prison. Outside, it's still dark. A small group of officers and witnesses stand waiting. And at exactly 12:50 a.m., Bennett becomes the last U.S. soldier executed by court-martial. But the real story? It started years earlier in Chatham, Virginia. John grew up poor. He dropped out of school after the 5th grade. His childhood was filled with poverty, neglect, and trauma. He was also epileptic, suffering from seizures that went untreated for most of his life. At 17, like many young men trying to escape hopeless surroundings, he joined the Army. In 1954, he was stationed in Austria with the 11th Army Division. That's where everything went wrong. One night in May, after heavy drinking, Bennett entered the home of an Austrian family where he had previously been invited as a guest. The details are graphic. He was accused of raping an 11-year-old girl and then attempting to kill her by drowning her in a nearby creek. The girl survived. She later identified Bennett as the attacker. The Army launched a court-martial. There were no expert witnesses, no psychological evaluation, no consideration of his epilepsy or background. It was a quick process. Too quick. He was convicted, sentenced to death. But what makes this case stand out isn't just the crime. It's what happened next. Between 1955 and 1961, 8 white soldiers were convicted of similar crimes. All received death sentences, and all 8 had their sentences reduced to life in prison. Only Bennett, a black teenager with a medical condition, was executed. Even more shocking, the victim's family didn't want him to die. They wrote a letter pleading for clemency. Religious leaders called the sentence unjust. Legal experts said it violated due process, but none of it mattered. In 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy signed off on the execution. Bennett was denied a final appeal. That night, he said nothing. He was blindfolded, led to the gallows, and hanged. It took 6 minutes for him to die. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the military prison cemetery. Forgotten. But his story should never be forgotten. Because it wasn't just an execution. It was the last military execution in U.S. history. And it happened not to a hardened criminal, but to a teenager, poor, sick, and failed by the system. Not because of what he did, but because of who he was. And if you think that story is haunting, wait until you hear what happened to the next man. He wasn't accused of murder. He didn't harm a child. He simply refused to fight. And for that, he was executed by his own army. January 31st, 1945. The hills of eastern France are frozen. 12 American soldiers stand in a firing line. In front of them, tied to a post, is a terrified 24-year-old private, Eddie Slovic. He's minutes away from becoming the first and only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. Eddie grew up in Detroit, Michigan. As a teenager, he was a small-time criminal, car thefts, breaking and entering. But by the early 1940s, he had cleaned up his act, gotten married, and was working a steady job. Then came the draft. In 1944, Slovic was sent to France. On the way to the front, he got separated from his unit. For weeks, he stayed with a Canadian division, claiming he was lost. When the U.S. Army finally found him, Eddie handwrote a confession stating clearly that he would not fight, that he was too scared, that he would rather go to prison. But prison wasn't what he got. The Army decided to make an example of him. Thousands of soldiers had gone AWOL during the war, many out of fear. Slovic's honesty became his death sentence. At his court-martial, he had no lawyer, no witnesses, no defense. The hearing lasted less than 2 hours. The verdict, death by firing squad. Even General Eisenhower signed off on it. He believed the execution would deter others from deserting. On the morning of January 31st, Eddie Slovic was tied to a post. He refused a blindfold. A priest read him his last rites. At 10:04 a.m., 12 rifles fired. A captain delivered a final bullet to his heart. It was over. For years, the military hid the truth. Slovik's wife wasn't told what really happened until long after the war. His grave in France remains marked only with a number. No medals, no honors, just silence. Eddie Slovik wasn't a killer, he was a scared kid who spoke the truth, and for that he was executed by his own country. But Slovik wasn't the only one the military chose to silence during the war. Behind the battlefield, hidden from the headlines, the U.S. Army carried out over 100 executions during World War II. And the reasons behind those deaths tell a darker story still. Eddie Slovik was the only soldier executed for desertion during World War II, but he wasn't the only one the U.S. military put to death. Between 1942 and 1945, the Army executed 102 service members, most of them for rape or murder, not combat offenses. These men weren't foreign spies or enemy soldiers, they were Americans, and most of them were black. That's not a coincidence. Black soldiers made up less than 10% of the armed forces during World War II, but they represented almost half of those who were executed. A military review later admitted that racial bias may have played a role, but by then it was too late. These executions were quick, brutal, and almost entirely hidden from the public. In many cases, legal representation was minimal. Appeals were rushed or outright ignored. Hangings and firing squads were carried out on U.S. bases overseas. Most of the names were forgotten. Most of the stories were never told. It wasn't justice. It was control, delivered under the guise of discipline, and that shadow didn't fade with time. Decades later, in the heart of Texas, a young private named Dwight Loving committed a double murder so senseless it shook the military justice system all over again. Christmas Eve, 1988, Killeen, Texas. The streets near Fort Hood are quiet. Families are finishing dinner, some are opening gifts, but Private Dwight Jeffrey Loving is out for something else. He's on the hunt. At just 20 years old, Loving was a young soldier stationed at one of America's largest military installations. He wasn't in combat. He wasn't under pressure from war. What he did next was cold-blooded and completely unprovoked. That night, Loving called a taxi. His first victim was Christopher Fay, a retired soldier turned cab driver. Fay picked Loving up and drove him to a dark, isolated area outside town. There, Loving pulled out a .38 caliber pistol and shot him twice in the back of the head. He stole his cash, less than $40, and left him for dead. Minutes later, Loving called another taxi. This time it was Bobby Charbino, a family man trying to earn extra cash for the holidays. Loving used the same method, same location, same execution-style kill. And for what? Loving would later tell investigators he did it for the thrill. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't under threat. He simply wanted to know what it felt like to kill. But he didn't stop there. Instead of fleeing, Loving bragged about the murders on base. He even mailed the murder weapon to his girlfriend, trying to hide it, but also showing he had no fear of getting caught. When the military arrested him, he confessed without hesitation. The court-martial was swift and overwhelming. The evidence was airtight. 2 bodies, 1 weapon, a full confession. In 1989, Dwight Loving was sentenced to death. His case became one of the most closely watched military death penalty trials of the modern era. He sat on death row for 28 years, appealing the sentence at every level, from military courts to the U.S. Supreme Court. Defense attorneys argued he was young, impulsive, and poorly represented. They pointed out his clean record before the murders and suggested racial bias may have played a role in the harshness of his sentence. Prosecutors saw it differently. They said Loving had shown no remorse. He killed 2 men who had done nothing but try to earn a living. He didn't lash out in panic. He hunted, ambushed, and executed. And then he laughed about it. Appeals after appeals were denied. Until January 17, 2017, just 3 days before leaving office, President Barack Obama quietly commuted Loving's sentence to life without parole. No press conference, no major headlines, just one final stroke of a pen. To some, it was mercy. To others, a miscarriage of justice. Loving remains in prison to this day. But for the families of Christopher Fay and Bobby Charbino, it's a wound that never heals. Their fathers, brothers, husbands were stolen. And the man who pulled the trigger will live out his life behind bars, never answering for what he took. Dwight Loving didn't act out of war, fear, or trauma. He acted out of cold curiosity. And that's what makes his case so terrifying. But Dwight Loving wasn't the only one to kill fellow Americans without blinking. Just a few years later, 2 young Marines would commit a crime so violent, so disturbing it seemed ripped from a horror film. In the summer of 1992, 2 young Marines, Kenneth Parker and Wade Walker, committed a crime that would send shockwaves through the U.S. military. Their victims weren't enemies in combat. They weren't hostile civilians, they were fellow Marines, lured into the woods and slaughtered like prey. The victims, Lance Corporal Ronnie Ellis and Lance Corporal Christopher Z. Johnson, were found brutally beaten and stabbed in a remote wooded area near Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. One of them had been decapitated. The investigation moved fast. Parker and Walker were known to have been with the 2 victims the night before, and soon, a disturbing truth emerged. The murders had been premeditated. Witnesses said Parker had talked openly about killing someone just to know what it felt like. Investigators found symbols carved into trees at the murder site, most hauntingly, the number 666. When questioned, Parker described the killings in horrifying detail. He even laughed. Walker, while less talkative, showed no remorse. These weren't just murders. They were ritualistic executions carried out by men in uniform, against their own. In 1995, both men were tried by military court-martial and sentenced to death. They joined the rare group of U.S. service members facing military execution. But as time passed, the story shifted. Defense attorneys pushed for retrials. They argued Parker was mentally ill with a history of childhood trauma, hallucinations, and potential schizophrenia. They said Walker had been manipulated and feared Parker. They pointed out that no psychiatric evaluations had been done before sentencing, and in 2009, the military relented. Kenneth Parker's sentence was commuted to life in prison. Walker's sentence was also overturned. Both men would live out their days behind bars, but they had escaped execution. To many, that felt like failure. This wasn't a fog of war incident. This wasn't heat of battle rage. It was 2 soldiers who lured their own into the woods and butchered them. Some called it demonic, others called it psychotic, but one thing was clear: this wasn't supposed to happen in the U.S. military. But while Parker and Walker hunted their victims, one Army officer brought violence straight to his own formation. He didn't target enemies, he opened fire on his own soldiers. October 27, 1995, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. At first, it sounded like training. Soldiers heard the crack of a rifle and assumed it was just another drill. But this wasn't practice. This was real. Second Lieutenant William Kreutzer Jr. had climbed to a rooftop with an automatic rifle. From his perch, he opened fire on his fellow soldiers during morning formation. Dozens of unarmed men lined up on the parade field. Within seconds, panic exploded. Bullets ripped through uniforms. Screams filled the air. By the time it was over, 1 soldier was dead and 18 were wounded. But the warning signs had been there. Kreutzer had told multiple people he was struggling. He said he was paranoid. He felt targeted. He even warned superiors that he might hurt someone. He begged to be taken off duty. Instead, he was ordered to toughen up. During his court-martial, the defense painted a chilling portrait. A man ignored until he snapped. A soldier broken by pressure, abandoned by leadership, and allowed to reach a boiling point with a loaded weapon. He was convicted of premeditated murder and attempted murder. In 1996, he was sentenced to death. But in 2009, after years of appeals and psychiatric reviews, Kreutzer's sentence was commuted to life in prison. His case forced the Army to reevaluate how it handles mental health and how many tragedies could have been prevented if someone had just listened. November 2, 1994, Fort Lewis, Washington. Private First Class Jesse Quintanilla walks into the office of Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Kidd. He's armed, determined, and angry. Without a word, he opens fire. Kidd, a highly respected battalion commander, is shot multiple times and collapses behind his desk. Within seconds, it's over. One of the Army's top officers lies dead, and his killer doesn't flee. Quintanilla simply lays down his weapon and surrenders. What could drive a soldier to kill his commanding officer in cold blood? Investigators uncovered a motive rooted in humiliation. Quintanilla had recently received poor evaluations and believed he was being unfairly targeted for discharge. He felt betrayed, cornered, and in his mind, killing Kidd was justice. But the Army saw it differently. In 1995, a military court found him guilty of premeditated murder. He was sentenced to death. Like others on military death row, Quintanilla's legal team argued mental instability and command failure. But to this day, his sentence remains intact. He is one of the last soldiers still sitting on military death row at Fort Leavenworth, waiting for an execution that may never come. The system came down hard on Quintanilla. But if you look closer, you'll see a disturbing pattern, a system where race often decided who lived and who died. The U.S. military has long projected an image of discipline and honor. But when it comes to executions, the numbers tell another story. Throughout the 20th century, the military's application of the death penalty has disproportionately targeted Black and Latino service members. During World War II, less than 10% of the military was Black, yet Black soldiers made up nearly 80% of those executed. These weren't just isolated statistics, they were symptoms of a broken system. From rushed trials to lack of legal defense, minority soldiers were consistently given harsher punishments, fewer appeals, and fewer chances at clemency. Many of the white soldiers convicted of similar or worse crimes had their sentences reduced to life or even walked free. This wasn't justice, it was punishment by identity. Even today, the majority of those sitting on military death row are people of color. And while the military has acknowledged historical inequities, real reform has been slow and largely invisible to the public. Because these executions happen behind closed doors, far from the battlefield, far from the cameras, and often far from accountability. But beyond race, beyond guilt, one question remains. What drives these soldiers to snap? What breaks inside them? What drives a soldier to kill? Most of the men on this list weren't in combat. They weren't fighting for survival. They killed fellow Americans, fellow soldiers, innocents. And the reasons, they vary. Some say trauma, some say mental illness, some say hate. But one thing is clear, the military is not immune to breakdowns in the human psyche, and in fact, it may amplify them. Isolation, rigid hierarchy, extreme pressure, these are ingredients for collapse, and when support systems fail, the results can be deadly. But the military often isn't built to spot subtle signs, especially not in a culture that values silence, strength, and obedience above vulnerability. That's how tragedies like Fort Hood, Camp Lejeune, and Fort Bragg happen. That's how killers slip through the cracks, until it's too late. They weren't born evil, but they weren't protected either, and now all that's left are the consequences. That these men took an oath to protect, to serve, to fight with honor. But somewhere along the way, something broke. Some were shaped by violence, others were simply evil. But each of them wore the same uniform until they didn't. From execution chambers in Kansas to the battlefields of Europe, their legacies live on as cautionary tales about power, about justice, about what happens when the very people trained to protect us become the threat. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all, that the monster doesn't always wear enemy colors. Sometimes it wears stars and stripes,